effective feedback in economics. So we can look at the practical side in a minute, but can we just talk about content to start with? I'm painfully aware that good feedback is very specific, and so I'm not really expecting a one size fits all answer. But what sort of feedback isn't helpful in economics? Because I think while it's difficult to say what is helpful, I think there are certain things that I've done in the past that now I think, why on earth that isn't helpful at all. Saying things like more application, more analysis, when they don't actually understand what those terms mean. If we can just ignore school policies and Ofsted for one side, in an ideal world, what kind of feedback would be avoid?
Well, I would avoid laboriously writing much on anything, at least to begin with. And so I do try and avoid this in year 12 in particular, because the modal thing that's wrong with the stuff is they don't understand the economics. And so, yeah, you say put in more application or put in more analysis on something, that's focusing on the wrong thing. They've made errors, or there probably are some errors in this that led to this not coming out very well. So let's focus on those instead.
So do you do the bulk of your feedback, the bulk of your time focuses on feeding back to year 13 rather than?
No, the bulk of feedback for year 12 is class feedback, that I say these are the mistakes that we sort of all made. These are the things we can do about it. I use some examples. So instead of writing on them, I'll tend to take a few photos, or if it's Google Classroom anyway, pick a few excerpts or stick it under a little visualizer camera thing and say, well, this one we've got here, I might keep it anonymous, I might say Bob's one here, and illustrates this thing that they do well. This is a good example of some application or something. And yeah, lots of exemplar, lots of fairly generic, because the problems are fairly generic, I tend to find.
I think maybe to get down to the nitty gritty as well, is that if you're using examples, is that I know that Gav and you do this, don't you? Probably not with the same intent, but you do show two equal versions of the same thing, and you can pick apart which one's better, and that kind of comparative stuff. Modeling good examples is really helpful as well. So rather than telling them what they've done wrong, showing them what a good, what a bad one looks like and what a good one looks like, and showing the difference. They can often pick out those things themselves. They don't need us to point it out. They need us to point out what is good, not to point out what is wrong with theirs, if you see what I mean. Often they're doing the best they can, and if they could do better, they would have done better.
Classic Dylan William thing, yeah.
Yeah, well, exactly. Any other things that they found? Any other things that people have found that doesn't work? Getting work handed in on Google Classroom as you always have it. Yeah, being able to go back and look at something rather than that kind of the quick turnaround of, this person's got this book and then you don't see the piece of work again ever, and not having the good ones for longevity. So you used to forget to photocopy the good ones, yeah, and potentially then being able to look back year on year if you've got the right permissions and stuff, and being able to use them as examples in the future. Scan the good ones, or Office Lens. Office Lens is just the kind of office camera, isn't it, that goes straight to Teams and take the names off. And often they can identify each other's handwriting, but by that point I think they can separate the person from the work fairly easily. So how do we then manage to do that in the most efficient way? So now we know kind of what we want to do. What's the efficient way of doing that? Has anyone got any processes that they use? Obviously, Classroom seems to have helped with this a little bit.
Are you asking about the efficient way of marking or the efficient way of giving feedback?
Let's go with both.
Or both.
Go with both.
I get them to plan stuff for homework, do it timed in my lessons, and then when they're doing other stuff in my lessons, I mark then. But that's because I can do that in my school, because I've got classes of 10. So I have the ability to do that. So like today, my year 13s were doing some case study stuff, and they'd given me some extra questions to do. So I like marked it with them in front of me. But I think it kind of just, the restraints that I have are probably a little bit different to everyone else.
Yeah. When do you do whole class feedback to some extent, like Andrew and Gavin do?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Do you do that? Do you almost have a pro forma that you go through, or do you just have a blank piece of paper and jot it down, or do you just remember what you're doing?
We do a gap analysis.
Mm-hmm.
So we get them to fill in the gap analysis, and then we do whole class feedback. But I kind of just remember, so on my mark scheme, I'll just make notes on like when I'm marking them about stuff that they've all done wrong. So then I kind of get a bit of an idea. But yeah, I think I just remember, because I mark all of the same question of everyone's, and then so I know like what each question is rather than what each individual is.
So can you just explain what the gap analysis is a little bit more?
Oh yeah, sorry. So we give them like a pro forma, so then it's like the highest mark, and then what mark they got, and then what they should have added, and it's literally just like a table that goes on the front, and it's normally printed for them on the front of the paper. When we give them the paper, and they just like skip, and then it's going to have their targets on there as well. So it's basically just what they got, why didn't they get like the higher bits. That's basically it.
I think I have done in the past with it when I do exam papers, because I hate marking exam papers with so much of a passion, that almost like how to get each mark, and they tick have they got it, or have they corrected it. So if they haven't got it, they have to have corrected it. But that is slightly easier with the jumping through hoops at Excel, which I can see it ticking through Andrew's head already. It does mean you're reducing the mark scheme. The problem I have with whole class feedback, and I have used whole class feedback as the main form of feedback generally, is that I'm not very good at marking everything at once. I get distracted halfway through, or I only have 10 minutes here or 10 minutes there, so I'm not very good at doing it all in one go. So I found that I had to use a proforma, because and the proforma changed as it worked out what I normally like to record, but I found I had to have it somewhere, because otherwise it was on scraps of on the back of this piece of paper and a post-it note here, and it was just getting too crazy. The other thing that I do is that mainly, and it generally started from a point of view that I was off sick for quite a long time, and I still wanted to give my students feedback when they were sending me things, but writing endless, writing really long chunks just doesn't really tell them a lot. So if I'm going to give them really close feedback on something, I'll put it up on the screen and video the screen, and then literally talk through it, and I almost read it aloud and then give a sort of commentary. So because I used to, in the past, when I've had very, very small classes, I found it most helpful if you're going to go through something, if you're going to give close feedback, I found it more helpful to just do it sitting next to them and saying, look, yes, that's a good point, that bit there, I'd move that down there, and to kind of have that conversation. But when I wasn't in school, that was harder. But definitely I found that doing that via video was so much quicker than writing stuff on the actual kind of on paper, and actually they got a lot more from it. You don't always need it, because you don't always need to do a close feedback, but at one point I had a class of 2 students, one of which was aiming for an A star, one of which was aiming for a D, so that kind of whole class analysis sorts of fails. But so I think that can be another option, and I did find it quicker than the marking, but that's, as I say, mainly because I just hate marking. Don't use visualizers? Yeah, wouldn't be without it. But again, mainly because I'm really lazy and I didn't like standing to the board when I wasn't very well. I didn't want to have to stand to the board all day, so I wanted a solution where I could sit down. Any other bits on visualizers or feedback? Or
I was going to ask what people mainly use visualizers for. Is it like mainly for like the peer assessing and that kind of thing, or is it just
I love a lot of modelling in my case. I have written about it. I'll send you the link. But lots of modelling. Lots of modelling. I don't know. I don't know whether that's because it's quite because I like being explicit, or whether I'm just really bossy. Putting answers up from students on the board is another one. Gavin, Andrew.
Yeah, I will just use it fairly casually and randomly. I'll just whip someone's work off their desk and stick it under the camera and go, oh, look, here's a nice thing, or here's a rubbish thing, and they've got to deal with that. That's the problem. They don't like that. Yeah. So here's this one, and the reason why this is wrong is whatever. Yeah, a bit of class interaction, a bit of modelling, but my handwriting is absolutely abysmal, so I tend to do it on the whiteboard. Often.
You've just gone down in Gavin's estimations by the sound of things. The other thing that I do find the visualizer incredibly useful for is that the students at my previous school weren't particularly good at reading dense text. And we've spoken a bit before about reading, but modelling how you read, like particularly when it's dense stuff, and kind of saying out loud. So this has said this, so now I'm thinking that the next point is probably going to be quite important. So I've got my pen in my hand and being kind of showing how you pick apart something. That's hard to do when it's on a physical screen, but being able, showing that, I do this, and then this bit links to this bit, and being able to physically show how we critically read something, and particularly with a visualizer as well. The other thing I find helps is printing it on a small size within a big size. So I print an A5 piece or photocopy an A5 piece in the middle of an A4 sheet, or vice or A4 onto A3, but having that space to annotate it. So we've kind of touched on this, but depth versus frequency of marking. Do we have any particular preferences as to what you find useful, whether you find it useful to do lots of very frequent assessment? I realise that marking and assessment aren't the same thing, so I'm going to go for assessment now. Lots of very frequent assessment, or giving really good in-depth feedback once in a while?
Well, the elephant in the room is it depends what you're trying to do with it, and all the assessment stuff, all the Christodoulou stuff. It depends upon is this to generate a grade, in which case it should be infrequent and big, and is it to identify some weaknesses or problems, in which case frequent but small probably. And so I mean the thing we haven't mentioned about marking is that I would give out in class or some little mini multiple choice tests and stuff, all that stuff. That's marking, that's assessment in some way, but that sort of stuff.
Easier kind of feedback as well, though, isn't it? I think the kind of effort to usefulness ratio is much better in that kind of thing. So Manisha, you do kind of bigger end of topic tests and have it in chunks, and then Gavin, with Jamboard, I'm gonna have to look at this Jamboard because to take a photo of their work and pin it to the Jamboard. Is it a bit like kind of Padlet type thing? And then you project that onto the board. So I guess then people can see it. I think Padlet is. I think it's basically where you can just it's like a notice board, but you kind of pin.
Would the Microsoft equivalent be OneNote thing? That's.
I don't think it's not quite the same, but you could quite easily do it with OneNote. I can imagine. I think there are probably lots of options. It's strange, isn't it, that this time 2 years ago we wouldn't have been having this discussion. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, attach photos, documents, printouts, slideshows. You can kind of embed lots of things. But I imagine it has a very similar functionality, just in quite a different. I think the user interface is quite different, perhaps. I'm not sure. All right. Anything else anyone wants to say about marking before we move on? Whiteboard.fi, that's just it's an online whiteboard, isn't it? And the kids can write on it from their end as well. Or am I thinking of a different whiteboard? Yeah. Do you find that useful? Same things. Yeah. I think that's difficult. Is you need to kind of give things a go and get a feel for it, but equally sometimes you don't know how useful something is until you've used it quite a lot. And then you have the problem with things superseding other things, and then it's difficult because a lot of these things require quite a lot of investment to make them really, really useful, but then they become obsolete very, very quickly. It's a strange time to be in education. Okay, sunk costs, exactly.